Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture series on erotic art of the ancient world. I'm hoping that I don't get censored by YouTube. So before I launch into today's topic, a brief announcement. I'm canning the final paper for the class. You are all doing plenty of writing and doing a great job on it for these assignments. So I just want to let you know, don't worry about turning in a project proposal. Don't worry about writing a final paper. You're good to go on that. So today's topic, I'm going to start out by just discussing briefly the difference between nudity and eroticism in ancient art. There isn't always a difference, but sometimes there is. And then in the next lecture, I'm going to be discussing a little bit the sort of reception and the complicated feelings that we've had since antiquity about the way that both nudity and eroticism were treated in antiquity. So to start off, I want to just briefly take you to one of the oldest artworks of the Western world that we have. This is from 30,000, to 20,000 BC, and it was found in Austria. It's called the Venus of Willendorf, and it's a very small figurine. And what we see here is a schematic sort of abstract representation of a female body with a lot of emphasis on what makes her female, her secondary sex characteristics. So she has these sort of enormous breasts that her arms are resting on. If you look closely, you can see she's got very spindly little arms here. She's very voluptuous, so she's sort of healthy and well fed. And then we have sort of a lot of emphasis as well on her genitalia. So very early on in society, some of the earliest things that people are interested in representing artistically are symbols that we nowadays tend to interpret as sort of fertility symbols, fertility goddesses maybe, due to the way that the emphasis is really on the parts of the body that are involved in the reproductive process and in showing that sort of healthy abundance or even obese abundance that would have been somewhat unusual probably for people at that time, right? To actually have as a body type. So an idealized body type with emphasis on secondary sex characteristics tends to be interpreted as a sort of fertility symbol. And we see that as well in our Cycladic figurines. I remember we looked at these really briefly at the beginning of the semester. We also see mostly female figurines coming from the Cyclades from this period of the Bronze Age, and again, an emphasis on really representing genitalia in a way that is instantly recognizable, but not necessarily biologically specific, right? So we have everything moved up a little bit and sort of flipped forward so that it's very visible. And we have that sort of schematic triangular shape that is emphasized here, as well as breasts, of course. Not to leave out our men, we do have some Cycladic figurines that are male, and again, also emphasize really the genitalia of these people. And in this case, this man also seems to kind of have his breasts as well emphasized. And then later on, we of course see in both our Phoenician and in our Minoan and Mycenaean societies, as well as in further Near Eastern societies such as Babylonia, we see female goddesses who are occasionally represented as nude or partially nude, who seem to relate to these themes of fertility, female fertility in particular. So we have our Minoan snake goddess here on the left, this ivory figurine. And then we have a Phoenician, Mycenaean relief called the Mistress of the Animals, where we have, in both cases, women in tiered skirts, so Eastern-style skirts, but bare-breasted and sort of involved in interactions with the natural world. Here we have her holding sheafs of vegetation with these goats that are coming up in a heraldic position to either side of her. And she's often known as the Mistress of the Animals, controlling these sort of fertility symbols and symbols of abundance. So in these early cases, we don't see necessarily overt eroticism, right? So nudity is not necessarily represented as an erotic image in these early times. It often has more to do with a sort of symbolic aspect and symbolic interpretation of the images that you're looking at. And it is also, in some cases, the next one that we're going to look at, for example, not necessarily a positive attribute. So if we go all back to Egypt, back to our Narmer palette that we visited also early on in this course, here we see male nudity sort of confined to the class of defeated enemies and slaves. So we have our about to be smote male figure here, and he is largely nude in contrast to our King Narmer, who is holding up his mace and is elaborately dressed both with a sort of loincloth belted costume and his headdress, his crown. And then we have our fleeing naked slaves below, and then on the opposite side of the palette, where we have our beheaded naked prisoners, those are also depicted as nude bodies. So in some sets of imagery, particularly the Near East and Egypt in these early periods, there is male nudity in particular is often interpreted as something that renders a person submissive, right? Where we see the artistic emphasis on garments as a really important role in status, those are usually the same places that we see nudity representing a negative, low social status. Up next, as we move into our Greek period, a really major change that takes place is this sort of love of the human body, of the nude human body, a transition where nudity is not considered as a negative, but is rather a heroic status. So we see this both in our sort of monumental sphere, where we have large-scale statuary as early as the Archaic period, taking on nudity as a way of representing health and athletic ability, military ability, and we also see it in sort of smaller decorative arts such as face paintings, frequently for heroes. Here we have Achilles, the body of Achilles being borne by the hero Ajax, a scene from the Trojan War cycle. And I think it's interesting to note that Ajax is all done up in his armor. He's got his helmet, his breastplate, his greaves, but he is still nude. He's not wearing any clothing underneath his armor apart from his armor. So a real emphasis on sort of the masculine body as something that should be shown off, looked at, publicly admired as a positive image. And then, of course, in Greece, we've seen these figures before. The female body, too, a little bit later on, also takes on a high level of appreciation. So initially, we see these large chores statues cropping up, particularly in funerary contexts and in sacred contexts, and they are usually fully clothed in the peplos, that is the sort of garment of a high status woman. And then with Praxiteles and the Aphrodite of Cnidos, this goddess who is nude, the statue that he created in the 4th century, we start seeing, at least on the monumental scale, nude women introduced into the sort of opus of corpus of available works, and to be highly admired as a sort of erotic image bearing object. I hate to say that as well. So just to kind of close down this section of the lecture, in which I've discussed to some degrees ways in which we see in early ancient art nudity as a symbol of fertility, and then we see it take on erotic and heroic overtones, particularly in the Greek and Roman eras. We also see erotic art used in a variety of contexts. So there is sort of descriptive erotic art, art that is just depictions of sex or depictions of erotic situations. And then we're going to see these as we just delve a little bit deeper into the image of the Greek and Roman worlds. There's also a great deal of humorous imagery and also dangerous imagery that has to do with erotic topics as well. So we'll be discussing the way that these kind of spheres interact, and the way that images of fertility, images of sexual abandon and impropriety, and images that just sort of celebrate the human bodies and what they are capable of doing, all coexist in the Greco-Roman period in the visual realm. And are really popular topics as well. So what I want you to do is to today's project is a little bit more involved, a little bit more in depth, so some of the lectures are going to be shorter. And what I want you to start out by doing is going to Canvas. Under our files and weekly assignments, there's a special folder for this week's weekly assignment, and you'll find a PowerPoint called Ancient Lovers. It's just a selection of, I think, 7 images that deal with erotic imagery of the ancient world, and I want you just to choose one image that you're interested in looking at a little bit more closely this week, and write down the image number and maybe the title that you choose. That's all for now, and I will be back with another lecture shortly. Thank you very much.